Hey, what's going on, you guys? It's Aces High, and today I'm bringing you guys a little bit more of my Roman series. So something that I've thought about recently is several of my viewers over the last couple months since I started this channel. You guys have requested videos about the Queen. One viewer in particular, CJ, he has requested the Suez crisis several times, and I finally got permission from the channel, and then I forgot all about it. The problem is I get caught up in these series and I keep on forgetting to post these individual videos because I say, oh, I'll get to it when I'm done with the series, and I forget all about it. So thanks to a few viewers for bringing up the idea. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do 2 days of a series and then 1 day of a random video. That way that every third day is just another random video on whatever you guys want to see. So we can do it on the Queen, like yesterday, what happens when the Queen passes away. We can do it on countries that are unnecessarily big on a map or something like that, or just whatever the hell you guys want to do, including the Suez crisis. That being said, today we are getting back into my Roman series. Before I talk about today, make sure you guys come by tomorrow because tomorrow is going to be a big one. It's going to be titled His Year, Julius Caesar. We're getting into Caesar finally. That being said, today is going to be his year, Cato, 62 BC, and then we're going to roll straight into that because it's only straight from that because it's only 6 minutes into Roman elections, so we can learn how the elections worked. So I'm actually really excited about that. That being said, if you guys haven't subbed, hit that sub button, help me out. I'm really trying to reach 1,000. I'm having a lot of fun doing this, but I need your help. I'm gonna sit back. I'll shut up and let's get started.
Cato was never elected consul, so video over. Goodbye. But I feel like talking about Cato, so let's look at his term as tribune of the plebs in 62 BCE. Well,
Okay.
mostly. For whatever reason, tribunes of the plebs took office on December 10th, so the beginning of Cato's year slightly overlaps with the end of Cicero's year. When Cato
I wonder if that is like kind of the same reason that like the U.S. Senators versus presidents take office on different days. You know, they are about, I think it's like 15 days difference or something like that. It's early January compared to late January for the president. So I don't know, probably the same type of thing. So that all the government doesn't change on one day.
Cato took office late in 63 BCE, the conservatives had already joined forces and destroyed most of the Catiline conspiracy. The city was now safe, but sharply divided. Groups of Cato took office, mostly. For whatever reason, tribunes of the plebs took office on December 10th. Groups of Catilina's supporters had been hanging around outside of the Senate House,
Sorry about that. I don't know what happened.
and threatening to start a riot. In this context, Cato's role as the tribune of the plebs became all the more important. There were 10 of them elected every year, and they could propose legislation to both the popular assembly and to the Senate. They could also veto any legislation or action coming from any other elected official. You can think of them as a popular counterbalance against the Senate. It was kind of strange that a staunch conservative and a creature of the Senate was elected to this office, which was usually dominated by populists and reformers. But with the conservatives politically ascendant, and the city still on the brink of violence, Cato knew that everyone was anxious to see what his faction was going to do next. The first thing Cato did was introduce legislation related to the grain dole. For the past 60 years, Rome had operated a public program where they had bought grain from overseas, stored it in government-run warehouses, and sold it at subsidized rates throughout the year to poor citizens who met certain requirements.
That's cool.
Traditionally, the conservative faction had liked to make a show of chipping away at the grain dole whenever possible. Now, Cato put legislation forward that would quadruple the size of the dole overnight. So what was Cato doing? He was co-opting one of the big legislative goals of the reform faction. He was betting, rightly in my opinion, that a well-fed city was much less likely to support radical revolutionaries like Catilina. He also wanted to associate reformers with the negative aspects of the Catiline conspiracy, and disassociate them from some of the more popular stuff, like expanding the grain dole. Cato introduced the bill before the Senate, and although Cicero, as consul, raised some objections at the extremely high cost of the bill, many other conservatives got on board, and it passed easily. As you would expect, it was even more popular with the public assembly, who stood to benefit from the bill directly. It was passed into law. Imagine the logistical nightmare of having to buy and store all of that additional grain. Some poor bureaucrat's job instantly got 4 times harder. Sometime later, Cicero had left office. The leading conspirators had been executed, but a small ragtag rebel army remained on the field. Another tribune of the plebs, a guy named Metellus Nepos, put a bill before the Senate to recall Pompey and his army from the east and to have him take command of the city. Cato opposed this, saying that the conspiracy was under control and, hey, let's be reasonable. We've got two perfectly competent consuls here, elected by the people. Why don't we just let one of them take care of the army? Metellus responded by calling Cato a coward and threatened to ignore the Senate's advice on this matter and take the bill directly to the public assembly. Cato responded by saying something along the lines of, Pompey and his army enters this city over my dead body. Let's back up for some context. The last time somebody had taken command of the city, they had installed themselves as dictator and systematically murdered their political opponents. I've touched on this before, this was Sulla. Pompey had been one of Sulla's lieutenants, so you can understand why this was setting off alarms in Cato's head. He had no intention of letting history repeat itself.
Right.
Days later, Metellus did as he had promised, and took his bill to the public assembly without the consent of the Senate. Cato went down there with another conservative tribune of the plebs to put a stop to the whole thing. Metellus instructed a clerk to begin proceedings by reading the bill aloud, and Cato immediately vetoed it. Metellus then took over reading the bill himself, and Cato vetoed it again, this time grabbing the bill from his hands. Metellus continued reciting the bill from memory, and Cato's conservative colleague threw his hand over Metellus' mouth to stop him from speaking. By the way, violence against the tribune of the plebs was a crime punishable by death, and this seems like an act of violence to me, but nothing would come of it. Anyway, the crowd saw this altercation going down on the stage, and started attacking the other conservatives in attendance. The crowd only dispersed when rumors started to spread that a consul was approaching with a gang of armed men. Something that would have been illegal if it had been true, which it wasn't. But the crowd scattered anyways, and the bill was not passed. Metellus was so bitter over this incident that he left the city in protest. Tribunes of the plebs were actually forbidden from leaving the city during their term, but considering the laundry list of illegal stuff that had just happened, nobody bothered to stop him. The Senate formally endorsed Cato's handling of the situation. They tried to go a step further and strip Metellus of his tribuneship, not for fleeing the city, but for starting a riot. But Cato talked them out of it.
Wow.
Side note, Julius Caesar had publicly supported Metellus through this whole ordeal. He was serving as one of the 8 praetors that year, but when Metellus fled the city, Caesar renounced his praetorship in solidarity. The next day, an angry mob assembled outside Caesar's home, wanting to march on the Senate and do God knows what. Caesar spoke to the mob, calmed everybody down, and sent them home. The Senate was impressed by Caesar's statesmanship, and restored him to the office he had just resigned. But Cato voted against this. Caesar had had some suspicious peripheral role in the Catiline conspiracy, and now he had some peripheral role in this Metellus affair. This didn't sit right with Cato. From this moment on, the rivalry between these two men would only grow.
I guess that's it. Like I said, that was kind of a short one. Oh, look, that's the little spoiler. That's the video that we're actually going to watch tomorrow. Let's have a chat about that, you guys. Remember, we still got one more that we're going to watch. Yeah, I mean, it's a real short video. It doesn't talk too much about Cato. It just kind of tells a little tidbits of history that they probably didn't want to stick in extra videos. But it does kind of tie things together, and I guess it sets it up for Cato versus Caesar in the future, any altercations that might happen. Anyway, let's go ahead and watch the second video. It is titled Roman Elections, so it's going to tell us all about the Roman elections.
It should be clear that the Senate was at the center of political life in the Roman Republic. And of course we know that in order to be appointed to the Senate, a person first had to be elected to the office of quaestor by the people. But how were they actually elected? And once in the Senate, how were they elected to higher offices? That's actually a pretty complicated question. If we're talking about elections, we have to talk about public assemblies. You may have noticed that when this comes up, I tend to just drop the phrase public assembly and leave it at that. That's been a bit of shorthand on my part. There were actually 3 different public assemblies responsible for electing politicians. Each was summoned at different times and had its own rules.
Really?
And most importantly for our purposes today, they each elected different politicians. So let's jump in. The most prestigious public assembly was called the Assembly of the Centuries. Century is in the Roman military unit. This body elected the highest ranking Roman officials, consuls, praetors, and censors. I haven't really talked about censors yet. They were highly respected ex-consuls who were in charge of keeping the official membership rolls for the Senate. In practice, every newly elected quaestor was inducted into the Senate automatically, but it wasn't official until a censor added him to the list. They were also in charge of conducting an official census, which assessed the net worth of each citizen and divided them up into different classes. These classes were important because they determined how people voted in the Assembly of the Centuries. There were, broadly speaking, 8 different classes, which were further subdivided by wealth and age into 193 voting blocks.
Wow.
Of the 8 classes, the highest ranking one was the patricians, who had 6 voting blocks specifically set aside for them. The patricians were basically the most prestigious families in Rome. Not necessarily the richest, but the ones with a history of public service, going all the way back to the monarchy. Most of these men would have been either senators or the sons of senators. This was an incredibly small group, probably several hundred people, but divided up into 6 blocks, they had immense influence. Just below them were the equitae, who were assigned 12 blocks. Think of the equitae as the top 0.1% of Roman society. Very, very rich.
So the second row is assigned 12 blocks. Is that just because they have a far higher population? I assume the top row they would give the most votes to. But I guess if it's only, 1% or something versus 5% here, I guess it makes sense to give some more votes. But it's still less votes per person, probably.
They were richer than the patricians, but just hadn't been lucky enough to be born into the right family. The equitae were considered an aristocratic class, with special privileges, separate from normal Roman citizens. But membership in this class was dependent on them maintaining their wealth. Together, the patricians and the equitae accounted for a little over 9% of the voting blocks. Now we finally get to normal Roman citizens. This group consisted of the wealthiest non-aristocrats in Rome, and is called the first class. Think the top 1%. Rich, but otherwise normal people. This class was allotted an overwhelming 80 blocks.
Wow.
From here, the wealth threshold decreased predictably. The second class, the third class, and the fourth class were each allotted 20 blocks.
Okay.
The fifth class, at the bottom, was allotted 30 blocks. And finally, below the fifth class, we have one final group, called the proletarii. These were people with no property and no savings, basically people living hand to mouth. These were the urban poor. This group, which was by far the largest, was allotted just one giant block.
4 additional blocks were set aside for artists. Really? Jesus Christ, I expected the poor to not get very much. This kind of blows me away that it's such a big jump from here to second, third, and fourth class. I still thought second class would get more than third or something like that, It's a huge jump going down, but 1 is embarrassing. Come on.
Additional detail. Classes 1 to 5 were each internally subdivided based on wealth. Each wealth level was further subdivided into 1 senior and 1 junior block. The senior block was for citizens 46 years and older, while the junior block was for adults 45 and younger. And now, finally, we get to voting. Each sitting consul had the power to call for a meeting of the Assembly of the Centuries, and would then set the agenda for that meeting. This agenda was almost always an election, but it's worth noting that this was also the body that officially ratified the Senate's request to declare war. But this wasn't War Day, this was Election Day. On Election Day, everybody interested in voting gathered on the Field of Mars, just outside Rome's city limits. As people arrived...
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought the Field of Mars was that when they were showing in one of our last videos, they showed a map kind of Rome. I think it was, we were learning about the Roman walls, and it was that big field just outside the walls.
They divided themselves into their blocks. Each block was marked apart from the others by wooden fences or pens that had been set up in advance. To begin voting, one of the junior blocks in the first class was chosen at random and given the honor of the first vote. Why one of the junior blocks? Just to make things more complicated. Each block voted internally, and when a winner was decided, the block cast their one vote before the entire assembly. It didn't matter how many people were in that block or how strongly that block supported a particular candidate. Each block's vote was weighted the same. But things get a little bit more complicated. All elections of the same type were...
Wait, did I miss where they say how many people ended up in each block? I might have missed that. If I missed it, let me know in the comments, because I understand they all vote as a block, and they each have their fenced-off blocked areas, and they come to a majority rule type of a vote, and then they all go with that answer for their overall block vote. But did they just say, and maybe I missed it, how you decide how many people are in each block?
conducted simultaneously, meaning that if, for example, 2 consuls needed to be elected, each block had to give 2 names. They couldn't vote for the same candidate twice. They basically had to rank their top 2 candidates. After the results from the first block were announced to the entire assembly, the other 39 junior blocks in the first class voted simultaneously. These results were tabulated and announced. After this, the patricians, the equitae, and the senior blocks in the first class all voted. For this reason, the patricians and the equitae are sometimes considered part of the first class, but I decided to separate them for the sake of clarity because, Jesus Christ, it's complicated enough. After these blocks were all done voting, there was another pause while these results were tabulated and announced. At this point, 98 of the 193 votes had been cast, which is like 51%. If there was a consensus and all candidates received an absolute majority of the votes, the winners were announced and voting immediately stopped. But if not, voting continued, progressing down the classes, until one candidate received an absolute majority. When that happened, it was announced, and the victor was taken out of consideration.
So basically, if the 1%, the first class and above, voted, I mean, other people may not even get the chance to vote. That's incredible. And then if they haven't come quite enough, then you step down to what, second class, third class? But I mean, you're never going to get down to the bottom. What's the point in even showing up to vote?
If all classes voted and there was still one or more candidates without a 50% majority, voting continued the next day, and then the next day, until there was a winner. That's kind of confusing, so let me try to simplify it. The question wasn't, how many votes does a candidate get? The question was, which candidate can get to 50% before the others? The moment a person got to 50%, they were done. The game being played here seems clear. The elites voted first, so if they could all get behind the same candidates, they never even had to consult the poor. When the elites were split, that's when the poor got to have their say. The proletariat had it really bad. The only time they mattered was in the case of a tie. But that was only one kind of public assembly. There were 2 others.
That's right, okay.
The tribal assembly was significantly different from the assembly of the centuries. This body was responsible for filling some of the lower-ranked offices, like military tribunes, quaestors, and curule aediles. Just a reminder, military tribunes were the young aristocrats that were elected and assigned command positions in Roman legions.
Okay.
Quaestors were the people that, upon their election, were appointed to the Senate.
Right.
Aediles were in charge of administrative things like public games, and the upkeep of temples, and keeping the streets clean. Now, the tribal assembly only elected half of these, called the curule aediles. There were 2 kinds, but their jobs were virtually the same. The only difference was that the curule aediles could be either patricians or plebeians, whereas the other kind, which we'll get to later, could only be plebeian. The tribal assembly did also have one high-profile job to fill. They elected the Pontifex Maximus, which was the head religious official in Rome, and was a lifetime appointment. Pontifex Maximus
And if we remember from the last video we watched, at one point it was Julius Caesar.
aside, these offices were all lower in status, and the method of voting reflected this. Just like before, the tribal assembly was usually summoned by and had its agenda set by consuls. Praetors could do this too, but in practice it was usually consuls. Voting happened like this. All Roman citizens were organized into 35 tribes. These tribes were not based on ethnic divisions, but rather on where the person lived. They were geographic. Kinda. 4 tribes were set aside for the city of Rome, and the other 31 were spread out over the rest of Roman territory. We don't know
Okay, that's
exactly
cool.
how they were spread out, but we do know that most of them were concentrated in Italy. That all seems pretty straightforward, but
Yeah.
here's the curveball. Tribal membership was hereditary, meaning that if a family moved, they took their tribal affiliation with them. After generations
So what about if everybody just moved back to Rome? You know?
of internal migration, you can understand how this became a complete mess. Censors did their best to clean things up by manually changing people's tribal affiliation, but it was an impossible task. When the tribal assembly was called, the tribes
Oh,
separated
I see. I understand now. I thought that they were saying that the elected officials, if they moved, then they took their area with them. So you could live. I thought they were saying you could live like in Rome now, but control southern Italy, and the people that were there control their vote. You know. Instead, it's if you were born that one section, you're still part of that vote. That doesn't make much sense either, but that's a little. That's definitely less confusing.
into their 35 pens. Each tribe, or block, got one vote. And by one vote, I mean they each gave their list of their top candidates, just like before. One block was chosen at random to start things off, and voting continued randomly until a candidate or candidates received an absolute majority of 18. When that happened, voting immediately stopped. Unlike the assembly of the centuries, there was no overt bias in the tribal assembly towards the rich. It was
Hmm.
still a race to 50%, but voting was randomized, so each tribe had an equal chance of getting their voice heard. But it certainly wasn't fair. Citizens living in Rome found it easy to set aside a day to vote in the tribal assembly, so the 4 blocks representing the city tended to be very large and very poor. But the further you got from Rome, the fewer people were able to make the trip. This made these blocks smaller but of equal electoral weight.
Wow.
Those who did make the trip from the Italian countryside and beyond tended to be older, richer, and more powerful on average.
It's again, I've seen so many connections with the Roman history and the U.S. government and how we work things. It's interesting because I've heard in the past that a number of founding fathers to the U.S. Of course, you know they based a lot of their government off of several governments around the world. But I heard that several of them kind of they were enthusiasts of the Roman Empire, things like that. So it makes sense they'd add some things in like that. But we have our electoral college for electing a president, and it doesn't always work out. You see, the electoral college is supposed to be based off population. Basically, the more population you have, the more votes you get. It doesn't always work out that way though, because there's a minimum of 3 first off. So if you're just a basic small state, you have 3, just like that. That being said, as you're moving up, I mean, you look at the population of, I can't say 2 states off the top of my head, but 2 different states. One state may be 3 or 4 times the population, but it will only have twice or 2.5 times as many electoral votes. You know, so then suddenly the people in that bigger state aren't weighed as equally. It's kind of a broken system, honestly, and it leads to a lot of problems where, like, for instance, I don't know, several elections though have seen where one candidate will win the popular vote. They will be voted the most by us as American citizens, but they will not win the electoral college. So they will actually not win. It's interesting, you know. And on top of that, we may have electoral college votes, uh, and our representatives they are based off our population loosely, but they don't even have to vote how we voted. They get to cast their own vote. So it's kind of like, what's the point in voting as an American citizen for your president? Because I'm from Washington State. We typically here, we're a very, very left state out of all the United States states politically. It's very, very rare that they vote for anybody on the right political wing. It's a very, very left state. That being said, let's say that we all turn around and we vote for the left candidate, and our people could turn around and they could actually vote for the other candidate that we didn't want, just because they want to vote for them. The only downside is we probably won't reelect them. but they can still get away with it. So it's kind of a screwed up and broken system.
As a whole, this meant that the tribal assembly tended to favor the interests of rich Italian landowners at the expense of the urban poor.
Hmm.
Sometimes the tribal assembly was called on to vote on something less important than an election. When this happened, 18 of the 35 tribes were selected at random and told to meet in the Forum in the center of Rome. Here, this limited group voted in a similar manner. We get the impression that these meetings were very poorly attended, because a rule had to be made that a block had to have at least 5 people in it in order to vote.
Wow.
That's pretty bad. This assembly couldn't declare war like the Assembly of the Centuries could, but it did have a few other jobs. It was possible for an important trial to be decided before the tribal assembly, but this became less common over time. They also technically had the power to rubber stamp legislation passed by the Senate, but that was almost always done by another group. In the video about the year 57 BCE, the one where Cicero's banishment was overturned, I cut out a big chunk related to this because it derailed the story, but I might as well bring it up here.
I really like all these videos in Historia Civilis, but this one specifically, there's a lot of white screens and a lot of just blank screens I'm not enjoying.
The first bill overturning Cicero's banishment had been passed by the Senate, but Clodius had successfully stopped its ratification when he and his armed supporters marched on the crowd. What I didn't mention was that Pompey made sure that the next time the bill came up for ratification, it went before the tribal assembly instead. As I said before, the tribal assembly tilted in favor of the rich Italian landowners, who happened to be big fans of Cicero. So when Pompey toured the Italian countryside whipping up support, what he was actually doing was meeting with Cicero's supporters and convincing them to make the trip to Rome to attend the tribal assembly. The plan worked, because when the bill came up, every bloc that voted in the tribal assembly voted in favor of the bill.
Wow.
But this was an unusual event, and normally the Senate's legislation went before a third kind of public assembly, which we get to now. The plebeian assembly, also known as the Council of the Plebs. You can probably guess from the name what it means. Only plebeians were allowed to vote in this body, no patricians allowed. The plebeian assembly was summoned by and presided over by a tribune of the plebs. On election day, this body elected plebeian aediles, which we talked about before, and tribunes of the plebs. Unlike the other two assemblies, this one didn't have complicated rules governing it. This was a straight up or down vote. This is the closest to democracy that Rome got. The plebeian assembly was the only body where the urban poor could dominate. This is why we have a long line of tribunes of the plebs, even conservative ones, that got elected by promising either subsidized or free food. The plebeian assembly had another equally important job. This was the body that almost always gave its rubber stamp approval to Senate legislation. The only rule was that there were no amendments and no debate, just a simple yes or no vote. The moment a bill passed the plebeian assembly, it became law. By the late Republic, alongside an increase in political violence and gridlock in the Senate, we start to see this body elect a series of extreme tribunes of the plebs. It's hard to single out things like this, but I can't help but think that if the poor hadn't felt muzzled in the Assembly of the Centuries and the Tribal Assembly, they wouldn't have felt it necessary to stack the one office they had control over with dangerous men. But we'll never know for sure.
Alright, that's that. It's extremely complicated. Something I keep on finding interesting though, and it makes sense. I'm sure that you guys all over the world probably see this with your governments too, but every time that I'm watching and learning new stuff about the Roman government, I'm finding a lot of connections to our modern day American government and how it works. And I'm sure it's just like that for governments all over the world because as new governments show up, they oftentimes learn and build off of older governments. And this was just such a mighty empire at one point that it makes sense, you know? All right, well, hope you guys enjoyed it. Like I said, tomorrow is a big one. It's going to be Julius Caesar. And then I think the day after, we're probably going to get into the Suez crisis. So I'm pretty stoked for that. Till next time, hope you guys enjoyed it. This is Sai. I'm out.